There we go. So welcome on behalf of Paddleboard Maidenhead team, because this was for part of the staff training, because we've spent all lockdown. That's the only place we've been able to paddle is the Jubilee River, with the Thames being so high. So we've been busy loving it by removing litter, and now we want to know even more about it. So welcome, Brian. I've got to find him now.
I can see me.
You can see it. Well, everyone needs to. Oh, I see. Yes. So we don't necessarily. Yes. No. It'd be nice to see your face. Let's pin you, Brian. We'll replace spotlight. I think that's it. There we go.
Oh,
off you go, Brian. The floor's all yours.
Well, just hoping that picture doesn't put everybody off. But hello, everybody. Thanks for welcoming me on this rather cool and slightly damp Thursday evening to talk about the Jubilee River. And it's an area I've had quite a bit of familiarity with, because I was walking that area and bird watching that area before they even started building this little bit of a stream. And the Environment Agency asked a couple of us to get involved to monitor the wildlife before they started cutting soil. And then we were invited to carry on doing it afterwards, and they even offered to pay us, so that was even better. So for about 10 years, I was monitoring both banks of the Jubilee River for all the wildlife we could find. So it was an interesting thing. So what I want to talk to you this evening about is, first of all, probably you know why it was created, but we'll look at the history of that first, then at how they actually built it and with what in mind. Then we'll look at the wildlife along it. So anybody that lived in this area in 1894, I don't know whether any of you remember this, probably not. This was a typical picture of how Cookham might have looked at that particular year, which was one of the really bad floods at the end of that century. And of course, there's been many, and I've only got photographs of a few here. This was 1972, going through the Maidenhead area. Some of you might remember that one. And then there's been so many. And if we only go back to more recent times, this is what Runnymede looked like in 2013. And bearing in mind, of course, that was an area that hadn't tended to flood greatly in previous years. The thought was that it was actually the provision of the Jubilee River that had caused this one. So that was a little bit of an irony. But nonetheless, as we all know, this whole area's had a history of flooding. We are on the floodplain, particularly in the Cookham area. So we shouldn't be too surprised. So somebody came up with a bright idea of having a project called the Hydraulic Channel, which was going to be a flood alleviation scheme, would bypass Cookhams and the Maidenhead area, Taplow, etc., be joining the Thames somewhere in the Windsor area, and that would at least prevent in our patch all these horrible floods. That was the plan. The budget was set in the early stages at £110 million. We all know what happens to these budgets with projects of this nature. And it was just going to be called the Hydraulic Channel, which doesn't sound very exciting, does it? But it was at that time going to be the largest man-made river in the United Kingdom. We've not had a big history like the Dutch of creating water systems on this scale. So it was quite a project, quite an undertaking. And I don't know how easy it is to see the detail of this map, but I'll put it up anyway, and I'll use my little pointer to show you that the blue area is where the Thames currently always has run. And then this red line is the eventual route that they managed to negotiate after years of discussing with landowners and whatever, the route of this new river scheme, the flood alleviation scheme. So that was what the idea was. And as I say, it took quite some years to get the route sorted out. But at long last, they got that all agreed. And some might remember what this area looked like. You were talking about it before we started off this evening, the weirs at the Taplow end, and in the background there, the good old Paperworks, paper company that used to be there. Some of you may remember. Now that is not actually the start of the Jubilee River. It's where the control of the amount of water that comes into the Jubilee River starts. But way, way back over here, way beyond where the paper mill was, is where this river, this network, joins onto the Thames. It's about 400 or 500 meters back along that way. And there's a private footpath that I would have to get the key and access to survey that section every month for 10 years. So I got quite familiar with that little bit. Now a lot of this, of course, is back gardens leading down onto the water's edge and looks a bit different. But normally, and this is showing the 3 gates open, but as, oh, sorry, I don't know how that happened. Normally, there would probably only be one of these open as a sort of trickle flow, just to keep what they call a water sweetening flow through the river just to stop it sort of getting stagnant like a canal would. And they'd normally open a second or a third gate when the Thames has gone up to a particular level, and then they increasingly put more water through here. I remember the first day that they opened it for real, which wasn't long after it was officially finished, and they had to quickly open these 3 gates in very short notice. And down the bottom here is an island, the beginning of an island somewhere about here. And it took about 15 feet off the front of that island right up to the height of it. The sheer force of water against the front end of that island just eroded it in minutes. So give you some idea of the force of water that can come through those weirs. So the design was just to have what they called this canal, this hydraulic channel. And a number of us in the area who are very keen on wildlife called for a meeting with the Environment Agency and put a whole load of ideas to them about the ways that they could improve the local area by some of these features you can see listed on this slide. And eventually they agreed, and the net result was that in addition to the channel, they would provide a huge area of native woodland, 38 hectares of reed bed, there was none of that planned, a huge area of wildflower grassland, 250,000 native trees and shrubs, all sorts of bird boxes, fish passes we mentioned would be good. And then, of course, a large wetland ecology study area. And you'll be thinking, where's that? Well, I'll come back to that later. And then, of course, bird watching facilities, hides, and the like. So all of this were thrown in. So when we look at what the final budget was, which was way over the £110 million, as you can imagine, some people might point to these and say, well, it's all your fault. You shouldn't have asked for all of this. But to be honest, the majority of what we were asking there for was almost self-effective in terms of cost. We had a lot of volunteers ready to come and help do the work. So it wasn't a big impact on the project as a whole, but they agreed it. And we were thrilled, of course, that that had happened. So some of the features that we see there now that have not been originally planned is these widening areas. This is Dawny Wetlands, as it's known, where the twin bridges are. That was just going to be a straight through river, the same width as everywhere else. And we argued for some islands and scrapes to attract waders and overwintering gulls and all of this sort of thing. So they were provided, and that's one of the reasons why it's so much wider at that particular point. Here's another angle of them. You can see how old this photograph is, because if you look at that now, it looks rather less than Dawny Wetlands and looks a bit more like Dawny Woodlands, because all of these islands now are all grown over with trees and shrubs, as you probably know. These 2 banks, this one over here and an equivalent one over here, they were in the original scheme, but purely because all of the sludge and silt they were removing, they didn't want to go to the cost of taking it all off site. So they simply piled it up on either side of the river and put a great big mound of clay and then soil on top. And that's where they started planting all these extra trees and the wildflower meadows. So that was easily accommodated and a good way of getting rid of all the spoil that had to come out, as you can imagine. Of course, nobody had chosen a name at this stage. It was still being called the hydraulic channel for a long time into the project. So a scheme was derived. I'm not quite sure whether it originated by the Maidenhead Advertiser or somebody else, but through all of those medium, people were able to put in their suggestions as to what it should be called. And you can see some of the suggestions here: Aquarius, the Garter River, the Thames Moat, Baby Thames, all of these ideas. Of course, it was due to be opened. It's a major occasion in Her Majesty's reign. It was going to be a Jubilee year. So all of those that had suggested, why don't we just call it the Jubilee River? And I suspect she may have had a bit of a vote in all of this. I don't know. But needless to say, that was the one that was chosen out of all the suggestions. We'll call it the Jubilee River. And then, of course, later on, when it was finished in 2002, it had to be opened up, and we thought, how's this going to happen? And His Royal Highness the Duke of York was asked to come and do this. He probably wouldn't be asked to open a window at the moment, unfortunately, but he was asked to open the river, and he duly arrived to do this. And a small ceremony with a choice and select band of people to welcome him and see the unfolding of the banner and everything he would do to achieve this was going to be there. And amongst that very small and elite number was me. And the only reason I was there was one thing. Somebody had heard that he was something of a bird watcher. He was quite keen on ornithology. And as a result of that, they said, if he asks anything about what's out there, there won't be anybody among us to tell him. So can you turn up? And your sole job will be to have your telescope and binoculars at the side of the river, ready to show him anything of interest that you found when he arrives. So that was my only task of that. Well, sure enough, he came, and you'd have thought, being not far from the castle, just a couple of miles down the Jubilee River, he would have come in a royal car, and that's what we were looking out for. We were all stood in a little huddle waiting for the car to arrive, and I think we couldn't even see where he was coming, and the time was getting close, and normally the royals are very, very punctual, and then pretty much on the dot, perhaps with only 15 seconds to go, when it was quite obvious any car in the distance would take a long time to get to us, all of a sudden a helicopter arrived from out of nowhere and landed on the side of the river. There it is, that's him in his thing, and it just landed right down the side of the river. And of course, you can imagine what happened to all the birds on this lovely nature reserve. Off they went in every single direction. Every single one of them disappeared. And I'm stood there with my binoculars and telescope looking at a complete empty river thinking, well, I hope he doesn't ask now what's out there, because I might cheekily have to tell him why there's nothing there at all. So that's what happened. And then the group took him up to the top of the hill, and as I'd got nothing else to do, I joined in. And the press and myself, following up behind the good old Duke, we all started singing, "The grand old Duke of York, he had," well, we thought it might raise a little bit of a laugh. What we hadn't anticipated was he stopped abruptly, turned round and looked at these sorts of events, and you're not even singing in tune. So if we're going to do it at all, let's do it properly. So he started us off with the song, and we all followed him up to the top of the hill to unleash the plaque that's up there. By that time, I'd been asked to quickly get back down in case some birds had returned. But of course, as soon as he returned to the helicopter,
7:15, sorry.
Off they all went again. So he didn't get any bird watching that day. But at last, the scheme was built. It was open. We've been officially
We can't hear you.
I think someone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sorry, someone came in. If everyone can mute themselves, because someone else came in, so I muted, and I muted you by mistake.
Okay, so you did you get all the bit about the grand old Duke of York?
Yes, we got that bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Really good. Right, it's time to move on to the next section then, because what I'd like to do now is talk about the sort of target birds, the target species we'd hoped all of those facilities were going to attain. And we were looking for reed bed birds, as you can imagine, with all the reeds, some wetland specialists, the waders, and whatever that grassland area might attract. So this is what we'd hoped for. We'd hoped that all of these lovely reeds, and they're known as Phragmites reeds. There are different sorts, but all along the Jubilee River, the vast majority of them are what they call Phragmites reeds. And they're very thin reeded, they're the size of your little finger, and they grow very close together right down into the water. So the stems come up about like one's fingers would, as I'm holding them up here. And for reed birds that like to build their nests in the middle there, they can weave their nests in and out of these very close focused reed stems, quite low down, just a few inches off the water. And then as the wind is blowing the top of the reeds backwards and forwards and possibly moving them in different directions, at least at the bottom, they're all moving together, so it doesn't pull a nest apart. So reed bed specialists are experts at weaving their nests in the key part of reeds where they know it will not get pulled apart by windy weather. So that's why this particular type of reed is favoured. So there's lots and lots of that sort of habitat. And the first species we would hope to get, would you believe, it's a warbler, and it's in the reeds. I wonder what it's called. Oh, I know, it's the reed warbler, of course. And this is a bird that comes to us every year from Africa to just these sorts of habitats. And in history, along that particular route, with very few reeds anywhere, I think we'd only ever had about 4 or 5 individual reed warblers ever in that area. But by the time we'd done the first 2 or 3 years of surveys on here, we were soon up to 50, 60, 70 pairs along the length of the river. So it had a major impact in East Berkshire for this wonderful visiting species. There's another one that comes in and occupies the same sort of habitat, and this one is called the Sedge Warbler. So you can imagine with that sort of habitat, sedges and reeds, it's again looking for that sort of habitat. It will spend more time, as this one is, in a tree or a shrub rather than in the reeds, but then it will nest in the reeds as the reed warbler would. A very lovely songster. And they're only with us for a few weeks, but they might raise up to 2 broods. So it's a valuable habitat, and between them, they would have produced hundreds of youngsters every year in that new habitat. One, though, that's a resident species, has also got reed in its name. You might have heard of this, the reed bunting. If you can see the beak of this bird, and I'll point it out, rather than it being a long pointed one for finding insects as the warblers are, this is a very chisel, triangular sort of beak. This looks much more like the finches and the sparrows, doesn't it? And that's because it's a seed-eating bird. So it's looking for completely different food resources, but in reed beds and nesting in reed beds as well. This is a male of the species. And in fact, I don't know if there are any members here of Wild Maidenhead on the group this evening, but if you've been looking at their YouTube and Facebook pages lately, quite a few people have put photographs of this species up in the last week or so, and they look exactly like this one, with rather brown stretched out markings around the chin and the head. And that's exactly what they look like at this time of year, because they're just about to go into breeding plumage, and gradually this head and throat area will go pitch black, very striking black. And these colours here will be far more prominent. And they achieve this by feather wear. They're not changing feathers at this time of year. It would be too cold to throw off all your feathers and have bare areas for a while. So what is actually happening is that their winter feathers, the tips of the feathers are gradually abrading as they're out feeding and foraging, and the tips begin to reveal the colour in the feather beneath that. And that is what these black and lovely brown colours, that's where they're hiding. And in about a fortnight, 3 or 4 weeks' time, this bird will be completely black all round here and his chin, and these markings will be complete. So that's exactly what's going on now, and these lovely reed buntings took up the territory very, very swiftly. One of the things we were delighted about, now I don't know whether you'll have heard of this guy or the bird they named after him, the Sedge Warbler. I'll almost guarantee, though, that if you've been out on the river often, you've probably heard it, even if you didn't know what it is. It's got a really powerful, well, I was going to say a song. Not quite a song, it's more a call. And I can't emulate it with a whistle, but I can tell you what it sounds like as it does it. It goes whip, 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 whip. And it's very loud. If you're within just 20 meters of it, it's almost like somebody shouting right in the back of your ear. Very, very loud for such a small bird. So if you've been down at the river, I know you've recently been doing litter collecting and all the rest of it, and you hear this bird going chip, 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 very, very loudly, you'll have heard this quite rare Sedge Warbler. There were very few in the county when the river was provided, and eventually they've now taken over the full length of the river. I think there was at least 20 territories the last time I checked, and now they're working back towards Maidenhead, and we've got them down now at Battlemead, coming off the White Brook from the Thames on the opposite side for where the Jubilee River is. So they're spreading out and getting onto all the other adjacent waterways as well. So that's been a major success, because this is a scarce species. Another species that you can never be too sure how scarce it is. Nationally, it's a difficult bird to census because it's almost entirely nocturnal, and it's called the water rail. I don't know if you've heard about it. You might have seen something and think, well, that looks a bit like a moorhen, and it does, about the same size. But it's got this very long beak, which the moorhen, of course, doesn't have. It occupies similar territory, but spends most of its time deep in the reed beds, out of sight, and normally only comes out at night time. And it's called the water rail. And a particular feature of the rail is that when you see it side on like this, looks just like an ordinary bird, like a bit of a moorhen. But if you turn to face on, it's a very narrow bird. Because it's so used to having to run between the reeds to chase food or escape predators, it's sort of shrunk itself down. It's like a sheet of paper, and it can run around inside that vegetation far more effectively than moorhens or other birds can. So that's a peculiar feature of it. But with all those reed beds, we knew we'd get them. Oops, sorry, I've pressed the wrong button. We knew we'd get them there. And the only time you can really count them is to go down at night and try and mimic their call, and they will respond. So if you want to try it, and you go to the reed bed in the middle of the night and go something like this, which is exactly what their call sounds like. You can count them off, but know how many are out there. So we think we've got at least 10 territories along the river. But to be honest, nationally, nobody's really sure how many water rails there are in the UK, because they are so difficult to pick up on. Now, I'm sure we all recognise this one. We might even get them in the pond in our garden sometimes, the great grey heron. And of course, with all that water and vegetation around, they soon arrived to plunder what they could find. This shot here is really very, very annoying, because I don't know if you can see what he's got in his beak here, and whether you're expert enough to identify what that is. It's not a fish, it's a newt, but not just any old newt. We got one part of the Jubilee River that had been protected by the constructors because it had got great crested newts in it. And part of the mitigation was to make sure they disturbed existing wildlife as little as possible. So they'd done all they could to save this pond and these newts, and they'd succeeded, and they were still there when the river opened. But this heron came one day and was filmed gradually eating up all these great crested newts. And after all the work that the builders had gone to support them, they'd gone in minutes, thanks to Mr. Grey Heron. But yes, that's a very regular bird that I'm sure you see there. But what we hadn't got at the time, and has only really been a recent addition to the river, you may well have come across this, is this dainty little white heron-looking bird. That is actually an egret. It's about half the height of a heron. It's much smaller. Got very distinct black legs and very yellow feet. And when they're flying, those yellow feet stick out behind the tail. So that's an obvious feature. And this very black beak. And I can't remember which date they first turned up, but it was certainly a very rare bird in Berkshire at the time. And we got one, then we got 2 and 3. And now I guess you possibly see them down there almost every day if you're a regular. They're certainly regular around the Maidenhead area. Battlemead, we get 2 to 3 quite often. Odney Club has got one sitting on the heron's nest that was used last year. At the moment, I don't think they're going to breed, but they're moving in. They're getting more and more confident. It's a bird you could hope to see quite a lot of, I think. Come the summertime, though, of course, if the reed warblers are busy in there, they're going to get a visitor in their nest. And this is a bird that we're all familiar with. It's got a name that matches its call. And I'm sure if you haven't spotted that already, this is a cuckoo. Except this particular individual that's photographed here probably wouldn't be yet going cuckoo, because it's a juvenile. And this was filmed just after it had fledged its reed warbler nest, one of the many that they'd plundered down there. The cuckoos come for quite a short window of time into our country. We call them the British cuckoo, but to be honest, they're only with us for a few weeks. They spend the vast majority of their life in South Africa or travelling between there and here, and then just a short period of time, perhaps from May to June, laying up to 30 eggs in host nests such as reed warblers, pied wagtails or whatever. And then, of course, they leave those birds to look after the youngsters, and they go back to their sunshine holiday place in Africa and leave the reed warblers and dunnocks and whatever to raise these birds. And of course, they're enormous compared to their family hosts, as you can imagine. And then they have to find their own way, of course, down to the African areas later in the year, perhaps September time. So although there'd not been many cuckoos along that stretch for a while, as soon as the reeds were established, they started to come. One we had hoped to get, and we didn't know how long we'd have to wait. And I don't know if you can just about make out this this looks like a set of bagpipes, doesn't it, here and here? So here's what I'm talking about. Here's its beak, of course. There's the eye, this big barrel body. It is capable of standing straight up and sky pointing. And with all these stripes down the front, it then just looks like a batch of reeds. And if it's windy, it can even sway a little bit with the wind to make it almost impossible to see. And this, of course, is the bittern. Now, I don't know if you've seen any of these yourself. They are very of this project to construct them, which was about 8 years before it opened. We'd only got about 10 pairs of bittern in the whole of the United Kingdom. Well, because there's been so many reed beds provided specifically for birds like this in many, many nature reserves around the country, we think we're getting up now towards 100 pairs. So that's a very significant improvement. And I think it was about year 3 we had the first of these birds turn up. A couple of years after that, we actually had 3 in the reed beds there one year. But as we were discussing, Tara and I, before the talk started, I gather the fishermen have trampled a lot of the reed beds there. So I've heard of none arriving there this winter, and perhaps that's not surprising. Well, one bird we weren't too sure we'd get, it would have been a major bonus if it had, is this delightful, stunning looking little bird. This is about the size of a long-tailed tit, and it's got a tail just about the same length, but it's called the bearded tit. The Brits have got wonderful ways of naming our birds. If it sounds like cuckoo, we'll call it a cuckoo. We have a thing called a nuthatch. It does nothing about trying to hatch nuts. It's just a ridiculous title, really. But this one we call the Bearded Tit. The reason we do that is because it's not a titmouse at all. And if you look closely, it hasn't got a beard, which would be down here. It's got a moustache, because there's another one on the other side. So its proper name actually is the moustached breedling, but we call them bearded tits. And in coastal nature reserves with lots of breeds, you can go to Minsmere and Pitwell and places like this, and all year round you'll contact them, but very, very rare inland, and only a handful of records in Berkshire. Well, as the photograph shows, and sure enough, after a short wait of 2 or 3 years, we had 2 winters running where bearded tits came and explored the reed beds, and that was a major thrill for all the local bird watchers. Now, those scrapes and islands that we mentioned, they were specifically designed for wading birds that we hoped might nest, and this was another rare one at the time, the little ringed plover. This is about the size halfway between a sparrow and a starling, so waders do come very, very small sometimes. And it's an inland breeding species that comes to us for the summer. There were already about 4 perhaps regular breeding sites in Berkshire. We'd hoped this would be a new one, and indeed it proved to be the case. I think it was in year 2 they turned up, and so long as those islands that we saw out in the middle there were just covered in gravel and nothing else, they came every year to breed, which is their preferred habitat. But the minute the undergrowth started to grow up and the shale disappeared, unfortunately so did they. So we see them on passage occasionally, just for a few days each spring, coming through the area, and then move on elsewhere to breed. One of the birds, the waders that managed to breed a little longer on the islands, even though there was undergrowth like this coming up, is the red shank. You can see why it's called that. Little shanks are red. And this is a little bit bigger, about the size of a dove, a wood pigeon. But they actually like laying eggs in vegetation. So as long as it's not too tall, they were able to carry on for a few more years and breed on the Jubilee River quite regularly. I'm not sure that they still do, but that at least was some more success. Another bird that we'd hope to attract in with the lapwings, and you can see some lapwings here, they're the black and white ones here and there. But in wintertime, they're joined by one of the other plovers called the golden plover. And that's what all these others are all along here. We would get up to 1,000 of them. And it was always an amazing spectacle. The lapwings in particular are very skittish. And if a gull landed or a heron flew over, they'd all take off. And then this great mass of goldeny yellow plovers would go up with them. And they'd separate into 2 groups. They wouldn't mix together. You'd get all the lapwings here, and the golden plovers would follow them around. They'd squizzle around in the sky for several minutes and then all come straight back down again. And possibly only 10 minutes later, they'd do it all over again because something else had disturbed them. It was always a great spectacle. But they like this very short grass, as it's shown here, to feed, looking for earthworms and whatever. And again, as soon as the vegetation started to grow, I think they forsook the Jubilee River a few years ago, and I'm not sure we get any numbers there currently. But here's the lapwings. They've stayed on. They often breed down there just in small numbers, 2 or 3 or 4 pairs. What a stunning bird, as you can probably see here. And this is the female. She's got this lovely crest that comes up to here. The male has got a crest that goes out to about here. It's even more distinctive. But the ladybird does much of the work on the nest, and then the male joins in to feed. So a stunning bird, great success. In Berkshire, it's now getting quite a rare breeding bird, even on farmland, unfortunately, but we did well for a while. Another bird, this is an odd looking thing, isn't it? You think it might have a bill deformity, but this is another small wader. And this, of course, is the snipe. And this is his genuine bill. They've all got a bill like this. The amazing thing about this bill is it's not only very long, it's very pliable, and it can push the whole bill when it's closed down into the ground. And then in the ground, it can open up the tip, just the tip, to test and search for its food, leather jackets, underground invertebrates, whatever it can find. And that's how it feeds itself. They don't breed in this part of the world. The nearest breeding place, I think, is Otmore in Oxford. And they've got an amazing way of doing that. The male goes right up into the sky, very, very high, almost out of sight. And then it sticks out its very short tail, and the 2 edged tail feathers are very, very firm. They're like cardboard. And it vibrates in the wind as it then does a whole lot of spiral dives down towards where the female is. And it makes a sort of noise, almost like a Spitfire, a bit higher pitched than that, but I can't emulate it. But that's its display flight, and it's great to hear that, but unfortunately not on the Jubilee River at the moment. Looking at the waterfowl, the ducks and geese and the like, of course, we were always going to get the coots. I think if you put a bowl of water out in your garden, you get a plate full of coots turning up to breed. They're lovely little things. I always think it's odd. How did God create them like this, where the adults have got these lovely striking white faces, but the babies come out with red faces? And that stays with them until late. They'll have up to 3 broods. And so it usually takes about 12 weeks for the youngsters to get full size and then to take on the white face panel. So, but they look quite odd in the early stages when they're like this. And that won't be long now. The coots are already building nests. I've been seeing that this week. So we'll soon have the youngsters. And this panel here on the front, if I can point to it again, that is an extension of the beak. And all this sort of material is the same as our fingernails. It's keratin. So that's a keratin feature. And generally speaking, it's regarded that the males with the bigger shields attract the females. But to be honest, if you look at them closely, you don't see a lot of difference between one from another. So I'm not sure about that. Now, one of the ducks that we'd hoped to attract onto the river, and you might look at this superficially, particularly the one on the right here, and think, well, it's a mallard, isn't it? Well, I'm sure you know what the male mallard looks like, and this doesn't match. Now, this is the gadwall, a slightly rarer bird than the mallard. Quite common on many of the waters in the county, and occasionally they had bred in Berkshire, but not often. But with those facilities set up for them, we'd hope that's exactly what would happen. And sure enough, in the first few years, in small numbers, 2, 3, 4 pairs would breed on those islands. But to be honest, I'm not sure if they have in recent times. I haven't been down for a while, as I may have mentioned. But that again was a major success. I'm currently doing a survey for the Environment Agency for what is regarded as the extension of the Jubilee River, which theoretically should go from where this one ends at Windsor, round through past Datchet and all those areas and Egham, and rejoin the Thames at Teddington to try and prevent flooding in those other areas in between. And as a result of that, they've got to do some mitigation surveys on all the waters around that area, and I'm currently doing that. And I'm finding lots of these gadwall on fishing lakes and ponds and whatever around, and they don't seem to go on the river as often as one might expect. But as you probably know, the Royal Borough's struggling for funds at the moment, so this end of that river scheme has been parked. It's been abandoned for the moment, and they're pressing on with the bit around Shepperton and Teddington and all the rest of it. But I'm sure the Maidenhead bit will come up in due course. I wonder if you know what this is. Have you seen these very tiny ducks on the river or anywhere else? The Bray Cut is as good a place to find these, round off Bray Nature Reserve, incidentally. And it's called the teal. Isn't it lovely? This is the male. They're amongst our smallest ducks. I don't know if myself holding hands up is any guide to the size, but they're about that big compared to mallards, which are sort of way out here, quite small. And they come to us just for the winter, often from Canada or the northern climes, in good numbers occasionally. And we were very pleased to find numbers building up on the Jubilee River quite early on. And I imagine they're still there in at least some small numbers. Delightful little creature. Got a very high-pitched sort of wee, wee, beep call. It's quite distinctive. You sometimes just hear that in the reeds without seeing them. Just occasionally, though, they have got a very rare congener called the Garganey. Don't know if you've heard of it. This, again, is a spring migrant in Berkshire. It breeds in the Cambridge Fens and the Norfolk areas, etc. But we usually get, I don't know, half a dozen records in the county in spring, and again, perhaps coming back in autumn. And we're fortunate that for several years on the trot, the Jubilee River attracted 2 or 3 each year. So that had been a major success as well. So that's some of the rarer birds that we would see. Here we go. This is the one we're familiar with. And people might dismiss this duck and say, no, it's just another mallard. But come on, look at this. Isn't that the most beautiful piece of artwork you could imagine? You could imagine this actually being painted rather than being a photograph, couldn't you? Lovely mallard in its true, proper adult male plumage. Of course, we do see mallards in all sorts of different colours and ranges, and it is a fact that most ducks and a lot of the geese are quite happy to hybridize between each other, and you get all sorts of weird in-betweens. But when you see the true mallard in its full proper colours, it is a striking bird. And if you're not sure whether you're looking at a mallard, have a look at this feature, the tail. The mallard is our only British waterfowl that's got a curly tail feature here. So if you see a duck, whatever colour it is, and it's got a curly tail feature, it's a mallard of some sort or other. So rest assured they're out there. And of course, they do eventually produce these dreamy little chicks, which they'll be doing in a few weeks' time, I've no doubt. Everybody likes this bird. I can't hear a lot of applause and clapping with that remark, so I'm presuming some people are disagreeing. The Canada Goose. Well, I don't know, it's huge, it's enormous, it's floppy, it waddles about, it puts inches of poo down on your back lawn and your tennis courts and your cricket pitches. I think everybody knows what its behaviour is like. And it is an introduced species. This is not an indigenous species. It didn't even find its way here by natural means. I don't think it was introduced from collections or whatever. And of course, it's taken off in huge numbers around the Maidenhead area. There's probably, I'm guessing, 300 or 400 pairs, and they were often gather in big numbers. And of course, you can imagine with the Jubilee River being what it was with all its new grasslands, they started to turn up in hordes. An embarrassing thing happened on one of the early weeks just before opening. They, of course, had to plant all those reeds. They didn't just appear. They were all reared in trays, baker's trays, actually, the big ones, off-site. And then one morning, the landscape contractor turned up with 2 lorries full of hundreds, dozens, it seemed, if not hundreds, of these bread baskets full of reeds already in their soil growing to put in their relevant places around the islands and along the banks. And they spent 3 days putting 10,000 reed plants into these parts of the river, and then they all went. And then the inspector was to come down on the Saturday, I think it was, to inspect their work. Well, by Friday, myself and the ecologist had to ring him and say, I wouldn't bother coming, mate. They've all gone. The Canada geese have eaten the lot. Thousands of pounds worth of reeds, all gobbled up by about 50 Canada geese in just a couple of days. So they can be a pest, let's be honest. But one of the geese that had turned up that was perhaps a little less expected is this one. You probably see it. You're a bit familiar with it, particularly if you live around here, because it's one of the areas they're quite prominent now. And this is the Egyptian goose. I think it's this rather sort of spectacle feature around the eye that looks familiar to some of the sketches on Egyptian tombs or whatever. They're not just from Egypt. They're actually, a lot of them come from Canada. And the strange thing about them is that as big as they are, they're a bit smaller than a Canada goose, but it's a big bird. In their traditional habitat areas around the world, they actually nest in huge tree holes, big holes halfway up pine trees or wherever they can find it. And they have to be significant holes to take a bird this size, as you can imagine. But of course, when they came over to this country or got introduced to this country, very few trees had those sort of facilities. So they weren't breeding at all for years, and it was assumed they'd just die out. But they're quick learners, and they quickly spotted that associating with the grey lags and the Canada geese who nested on the ground, they eventually adapted and started doing the same thing, since when they've just exploded in the areas they're common, which is West London and our area in particular. Cambridge and the Norfolk Fens is another big area, but they're beginning to spread into many other parts of the UK now. So they're not unattractive, they're a little bit noisy. They're one of the earliest breeders, and I've already seen 4 or 5 broods this year of up to 8 youngsters. They get stuck in quite early on. And of course, everybody loves to see these amazing dancing ballet grebes, the great crested grebes. And when the male and the female come together and team up and do their little head dance and pass weed to one another, you know that they've got a nest already made somewhere and they're into their breeding season. And that's happening now. I've seen it earlier this week. So do keep a lookout next time you're on the river. What you might not spot, though, is a tiny little grebe, the little grebe. We call it the dabchick, if you've ever heard that name. And they're down on the Jubilee River as well, but they're very secretive. Very secretive. I only ever found one nest. And although in winter time you can see up to 20 or 30 along the river, I suspect perhaps only a couple of pairs stay to breed, but you don't often find them or know it's happened until well into the summer, when the adults bring quite full half-grown chicks out onto the water to finish off their rearing, and then you realise that they've actually bred. So do look out for that one. It's about a half size at least of the great crested grebe, so quite a tiny little jobby, but does spend a lot of time hidden in the reeds. Another thing we'd hoped to come down on the gravel, and if that wasn't going to work, we'd have been prepared to put some rafts out for them, are the common terns. These are gull-sized birds, look a little bit gull-like, don't they? But with this very, this very distinctive pointed bill. And when they're on the wing, they're not so clumsy as the gulls. They can dive, they can flip, they can turn. They've got very pointed wings. They're very elegant on the wing, lovely to watch. And sure enough, in the first few years, they would have bred on the Jubilee River on the banks. Over on Summerlees Gravel Pit, where I know you do a lot of stuff as well, they were breeding regularly on an island that East Berks RSPB created, an artificial one out in the middle, and it was there for some years. But then we had a storm, I forget which one it was, one of the named storms a few years back, and it blew it off its anchors onto the bank. And Mr. Pryor decided, well, he'd got rid of it now. I think some of the sailors had said it was a bit of a nuisance to negotiate around, so it never got replaced. I'm not sure they're still breeding on Summerlees, but they were on the Jubilee River for at least a few seasons. Now, if you're around any sort of water long enough, and you're lucky enough, of course, you'll encounter Kingfisher. Hopefully you're seeing them. Regrettably, of course, they tend to be a very dashing sort of creature, and very often you've heard the call, you've turned around, you've just been in time to see a blue flash go streaking past you, and then you're still trying to get your head in gear long after it's disappeared, and then you realise, I've just seen a kingfisher. Because they are a little bit hard to come by and very dashing on the wing. But look at this lovely picture. You can see the colours here. Now, I'm going to be very naughty. I'm going to challenge you now. If I was to tell you that's not a kingfisher, what might your response be? Don't unmute to tell me, but just think about it. Because he's not a kingfisher. That is the queenfisher, the female. Why should she be called the king? She should be called the queen. And the only way you can tell is the beak. Where's the beak? So this beak is all black. The upper mandible, as they call it, and the lower mandible is black. With the male, the lower mandible has got a lot of red on it. And you can see that close up. And that's really the only way you can tell one from the other. Well, fortunately, they've probably got other ways. So breeding is quite effective on the river. And here's one perched on one of those screens that you see down at Dawny Wetlands, those big wooden arch screens. It's quite funny. I was down there the day they came to install these, and there was no supervisor around. A couple of guys with a whole load of timber and some chainsaws turned up just where I was bird watching and said, "Here, mate, is this where one of the screens is supposed to go?" And I said, "Yes, I think it is from the drawing." Right, they said, and they started drilling holes and putting these poles down into it, and then they just shaved the top off into a curve, which is why it's the shape on this picture that you can see. And then they were going to go, and I said, "Well, what about the viewing holes?" He said, "What do you mean about the viewing holes?" I said, "Well, on your drawing, there should be some holes cut in there for people to see the other side through." "Oh, and they got the drawings out." "Oh, yeah, we're supposed to put those in." "Well, where should they go?" So I just happened to be there, and I stood full height with binoculars to my eye and said, "Well, you need some at that height." Then I pretended to be somebody a bit shorter and got down a bit lower. I said, "Well, you need some at that size." Then I was thinking of kiddies, and I got down on my knees, and you need some at that height. They just went through them all with the blades and cut holes in them. So that don't work for you. Blame me, I'm afraid. I put them in the wrong place. Well, we looked at a lot of birds in summer, but you know, winter down on the Jubilee River can be quite stunning. And look at this beautiful wagtail. A lot of people put shots of this on Wild Maidenhead or whatever and say, "Oh, I've just seen a yellow wagtail." And I can understand why they would say that, because obviously there's a lot of yellow around the bottom here. But the yellow wagtail proper is yellow all over, yellowy green entirely, and only comes in the summer here, so you certainly wouldn't see one in the snow. Now, this is the grey wagtail because of this lovely grey head and back. And this is a resident version. We don't have to wait for summer for it to come. It's with us all the year round. They nest alongside water features such as the Jubilee River, often under bridges in man-made compartments and nooks and crannies. And there are several pairs along there and elsewhere. This is a bird we'll see quite often around the waterways of Maidenhead, and I hope you've seen them. Lovely little creature. Of course, it's not just on the water that things are going on. They wanted to make sure that the river became stocked, ideally with fish through natural means, so they didn't have to do any stocking of it. So they put fish ladders in and hoped that the River Thames would gradually feed surplus fish in there. And the sort of fish I know that are in there, because the Environment Agency have told me, are little bleak, which is what that one looks like. Bullheads, of course, is bound to be those almost anywhere there's a bit of water. They're often caught. Roach is a common one, and they can get quite big, up to 2 pounds or more, but this is probably a medium-sized one illustrated here. The very small ones, fishermen will go and catch it in nets, and they'll use that as bait to catch pike. So they're often out for looking for large numbers of roach. It's a lovely fish, a sort of bronzy-sided fish called the bream. I think it's a member of the carp family. And that's quite a common water fish that the EA find down there. And this, as a tench, I used to fish when I was in my teens. I haven't for a while. And if I caught a tench that big, I'd be very pleased. I should think that's a near record-sized tench. And that's certainly the case with this perch. Now, this was not one caught in the Jubilee River. This is a picture I got permission to use of somebody holding a championship perch from some other water, but that's the sort of fish we're talking about. And that's how big they can grow if they're allowed to. So they're all in there as well under the water. Now, we'd hoped that some of the scarcer mammals might fare well, and there were 2 or 3 badger sets where they were going to build this canal through. And so we had to try and be sure, or they had to be sure they didn't disturb them. And they went to great lengths, to be fair, to try and make sure the badgers stayed. And when it had all finished, they were able to demonstrate the 3 badger sets were still active. So they did quite well. But amongst the others we'd hoped would turn up are water shrews. Now, I don't know if you've seen these little things. They're about the size as your thumb. Very, very light, as it says there, only 15 grams. Eat all sorts of little waterside shrimps and slaters and the larvae of caddis flies and this sort of thing. And I'm told it's very widespread, but I've seen very few in my time, and I've spent a fair bit of time monitoring, surveying, holidaying along waterways, looking for wildlife. I've only ever seen perhaps half a dozen of these. I did end up with one sitting on my foot once, trying to avoid some flood water in a nature reserve, but that was the nearest I ever got to one. So unfortunately, the ones you find most often are just unfortunately dead on the footpath. I don't know what happens, whether they get wintered out or whether it's just predators. They are horrible to taste, I'm told. I've never cooked one, but I'm told predators don't like them, so they'll kill it and hope to eat it, find they can't, and just discard them. So that's very sad. But there are some estimates around to say there's quite a few million in the country, so we're probably not losing too many. This is one of the things that we'll be after them, the foxes, I suppose, and they were very quick to take up on the Jubilee River, and I'd seen them swimming out onto those islands in the middle of the river to get to eggs and young birds. So they were quite a significant predator from quite early on. But as I mentioned, the badgers that survive, rumoured to be mainly a nocturnal creature, but as you can see from this lovely photograph of Gordon Rainsbury's photography activities, this is a daytime shot, so they will come out in the day. And you know, I don't know if those 3 sets are still active. I know where one of them was, and it was the last time I looked, but I haven't been anywhere near the other 2 for quite some time, so I'm not sure if they're still there or not. Generally in the country, of course, badgers are trying to hold their own, but the government and farmers are fighting back by bringing up schemes to eradicate them in many parts of the country. So what the future holds for Mr. and Mrs. Brock, I've no idea. But of course, the one we all want to see at any time by the water is the good old water vole. I don't know if many of you had lived long enough in the Maidenhead and the Cookham area to remember that we had water voles on most of our little waterway systems through from the town centre out towards Cookham and off down to Cockmarsh. You could walk along the streamside paths there and hear the plop, plop, plop of them jumping in the water every few metres. When I first moved to the village 40 years ago. That's not been the case for a long, long time. They were always quite scarce anyway, but in the places that they existed, they could do well. But then, of course, we had the problem of mink. Now, there have always been a few mink out in the wild, either escaped from personal collections or this sort of thing. Again, it's a non-native creature. But you may recall quite some years ago, the Animal Liberation Front went round all the mammal farms where they use this animal for its fur and let them all out. And it was estimated that in just a few weeks, 80,000 ravenous mink, accustomed to having 3 square meals a day, were suddenly out on the countryside, having to fend for themselves. And because they too are an aquatic type of mammal, it was all the creatures they could find along the riverbank and the streams of the nation that they went for. So moorhen, all the other little shrews and these sorts of things. And of course, water voles all pretty much disappeared in a very short space of time, like a couple of years. So we in Cookham and this area have had no water voles for, well, probably more than a couple of decades, I guess now, maybe more, because of these creatures. Great shame. I mean, they're an attractive looking creature. They're only doing what comes natural to them, but they're not a natural creature to this nation. And so they've gone over the top and ravaged and caused all sorts of problems. There's some indication that they're beginning to die out in places. In other places, there are active trapping regimes to try and reduce their numbers in the hopes that the good old water vole will return to us one day. And of course, being in the Maidenhead Cookham area where Kenneth Graham wrote Wind in the Willows with Ratty as one of the main characters, it would be hoped one day we might even see them again. Well, now that's a slightly bigger creature than the mink. Any idea what that might be? Have a bit of a guess amongst yourselves. Well, of course, the answer's got to be otter. Otter and Maidenhead. Would you know, when they built that Jubilee River, there had been sightings and spraints and rumours of otters around the back of that paper mill at Taplow. So one of the things they did when they constructed the Jubilee River at that point was actually to build a holt, one of these underground banks. They created a sort of an underground nest box, if you like, and then covered it all up with shrubbery and whatever, in the hope that if they were there and that they were keen to breed possibly, they would take that holt up. And then they immediately put a D notice on it so that nobody ever found out any more about what happened. So even with the people who helped build it, they won't tell me if it ever got used or if they were there or not. But you know, there's been lots of rumours and photographs and hints around in recent times that there are indeed otters returning to our part of the Thames network. They've been restored or found their own way back to regions of the Thames up near Oxford and north of Reading and into Gloucester. So if they're not already here in any number, it's probably just a question of time. So if you see a mink that looks about 3 times bigger than it should do, you may be lucky enough to have seen one of these. Of course, if you look at the habitation around the river rather than the water itself, all sorts of creepy crawlies. I hope not too many people are frightened of spiders. If you are, you better look away for a minute or two, because this is one of the favourite ones I found down there and continue to find on Battlemead and Widbrook Common and places like that, is the Wasp Spider. 3 guesses for why they called it the Wasp Spider. It's quite big. Its legs are as big as the house spiders we get, but as you can see, the body is significantly bigger, so it's a distinctive creature. Nonetheless, their biting parts can't puncture human skin, so there's not really any evidence that they're in any way, shape or form able to bite us as such, but it's a significant creature to find, and they are along there and these other waterways I've mentioned. And they build this very special web because they're out to catch the bigger creatures. An ordinary web that most of the orb web spiders would build, anything bigger than a small fly, they would fly straight through it. So what they do is they put this double thickness sections in to strengthen the web so that the bigger creatures like damselflies or even bees will still get enmeshed by the web if they fly into it. They call it stabilize. So they stabilize these 4 sections of the web. So do look out for those. They're very interesting creatures to find. Incidentally, that face at the back is quite a way back. That's not an indication that that spider is as big as your head. It's not. It's just a trick of the photography. And butterflies, of course. Now, I wonder how many people have seen some of these already this year. In the last week or so, all around here, our Wild Cookham Facebook page, Wild Maidenhead Facebook page, people have been putting records or even photographs of this Brimstone Butterfly. It's one of the first to emerge in early spring, if we're in spring yet. And the reason for that is that they're one of just 4 or 5 British butterfly species that hibernate as flying insects. Most of the others hibernate either in the egg stage on a plant somewhere, or as a pupa underground or hanging under a tree or in a garage or whatever. But the brimstone, the peacock, the red admiral, comma, and the the small tortoiseshell butterflies overwinter in the flying form. As soon as there's a warm day and possibly some flowers out, they'll start to fly. So I wasn't surprised to hear lots of brimstones on the wing this week. So I hope you might have been lucky enough to see them. But some of our moth species are dramatic as well. And this is, as you can see here, if I can get my pointer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spot burnet moth. And on knapweeds and similar, anything really purple they'll go for, but on all the knapweeds in the grasslands either side of the river, at the right time of year, late summer and into autumn, you'll see lots and lots of these stunning moths. And when they open up their wings, the underwing, the hind wing as it were, is the same colour as this. And it's just a flash, this crimson red. And it's quite small. It's, what is it? It's about just a bit bigger than, say, a hornet in length terms, and that gives you some idea of the scale of these other little tiny beetles that are crawling around on here. There's another one up there. Some of the insects, if you get down good and close to some of the plant life down there, you'd be amazed what insects you find there. Some of them are really very colourful and challenge your ID skills. So don't just walk past all the flowers. Have a quick look and see what you can find. Another one that we get down there, although this year was not a good year for them, you've probably come across this. This is the painted lady butterfly. You may have seen a program. I think it was in the middle of last year on the painted lady, where they've been studying it for some time because they've been wondering how it gets from where it starts, the United Kingdom, because it never turn around like birds and go back again. And what they've discovered with this amazing butterfly is it does come to us in several stages, all the way from Morocco. They'll travel right to the north of Africa and they'll lay eggs, and those will quickly hatch, and in just a few weeks there's a new bloom of flying insects. They fly further north into the middle of places like Spain and Portugal, lay another load of eggs, they turn into a flying batch a few weeks after that. They then come into the Channel area and some over into our country by sort of late spring, midsummer, and in a good year they will breed again and another batch will fly north and occupy North England and even into Scotland. So it's by sequence generations rather than in direct flight that they come to us. But the amazing thing is, do you know that they can now attach little satellite devices to the back of the head and the back of these little insects now, so they can actually track what happens next. And they have found that some of the adults that are bred in this country at the end of the season turn around and fly all the way back to Morocco, not necessarily in one go, but as a journey, ready to start the sequence all over again the next year. Isn't that absolutely amazing? So that's the painted lady, but this year it didn't seem to work. I don't know whether they heard about the pandemic and that everybody was indoors not looking out for them, so they didn't bother coming in any significant number. This is a lovely little one. It's a resident butterfly. It's about half the size or less of that one. It's called a small copper. I don't know if anybody remembered Gordon Langsbury. He was a wonderful local Maidenhead and Cookham wildlife photographer. He'd been a policeman all his life up until he retired from them, took up wildlife photography, populated many of the bird and insect magazines with his amazing photographs until unfortunately passing away a few years ago. Well, I was with him when we were photographing for a little book we were both working on. We were at a little meadow in Oxford and he found this creature and he was standing above it. Now, Gordon was about 6'6" and weighed about 20 stone, huge man. And here he is with his camera looking down at this. And I'm standing at the side with my little point and shoot camera, taking pictures of this scene of him doing what he was doing. And he kept getting annoyed and telling me, stop, putting me off. He eventually took this picture, this particular one here, and then sort of turned to me in a bit of disgust and said, oh, you could have lost me a good picture there. Why were you doing that? And I said, Gordon, I could not resist taking a photograph of a large copper, taking a picture of a small copper. And I've still got that photograph somewhere nearby. Now then, tell me, is this a white butterfly with black markings or a black butterfly with white markings? Scientists over time that put these creatures into their various anatomical families have held both views over time. And I think the current view is that it is a dark butterfly with white markings. It's called the marbled white. You can see why. And it's quite a significant size one. It's about the same size as, say, a red admiral butterfly, but pretty much entirely a grassland species. So those two humps either side of the river, planted up with wildflowers, attracted hundreds, if not thousands of these in the early years. Now, I must admit, I haven't been in recent times to do any counts, so I'm not sure how many are there, but I'll warrant that in any given year, you'll see quite a few of these on either side of the river, the marbled white butterfly, absolutely stunning. But on the other scale, you get very tiny little moths and butterflies there as well. Now, this flower, as you can see in the background, it's a daisy, but it's not an oxeye daisy. This is your ordinary little lawn daisy, tiny little flower. So across there would normally be, what, less than half an inch? Or something like this. So here's a moth with a wingspan of about 1/4 of an inch, called the Nettletap Moth. And they're quite common, but of course so small they easily escape watching eyes if you're not actually looking out for them. And another reason why, on a bit of time when you're not in so much of a rush to get along the river, look down into these little bits of flower, anything that's left by way of marginal vegetation, you'll see these amazing creatures. The orange tip. Now, this can be quite an early one. We might be finding certainly the males, which is this creature here. Whoops. Let me move my own picture out of the way. I can't see what I'm doing. This is the male with the orange tips. The female looks a bit like a cabbage white, actually, doesn't it? Cabbage white butterfly without the orange tips. But underneath, once either of them have landed and folded their wings, they've got this amazing patterning underneath, very distinctive. So the males come out typically a couple of weeks before the female, so you'll be seeing those first in the spring, later to be joined by this. And if you've got this plant, I don't know if you can recognize both the flower and the leaf. This is what I call Jack by Hedge. Is it wild garlic or hedge garlic plant? That's almost their sole feeding plant. So if you've got that, you should get orange tip butterflies in your garden or wherever. And then we get the little dainty blue butterflies, similar sort of size as that one, but not all of them look blue. And I was a bit challenged when I started extending my scope of my bird watching recording for the Environment Agency on the Jubilee River. They said, well, while you're out, can you start letting us know about butterflies? So I had to hone up a bit on them because I didn't know too much about them. And I realized that this one, although a member of the blue butterfly family, as they call them, is actually called the brown argus. And I thought it was very rare. And it was only rare because I hadn't got my eye in. I hadn't been noticing them at all. Once I started getting the hang of to look for them, I found them everywhere along the Jubilee River. Ladies' bedstraw plants, certainly any of the white or purple, or what do you call, the gorse plants, anything of that sort is where you look for those. Grassland species again, so do look out for that one on the Jubilee River. Now, I was down there one day looking in the reeds for this, that, and the other, and I saw this amazing creature. It looked all white and sticky, black and sticky and damp. It had got enormous antennae coming right up here, as you can see, and these amazing mandibles. Here's a closer picture of it, these great big hooky devices. And I'd never seen anything like this in my life before. And I had to take a photograph and send it off for identification, and the guy came out and says, this is Mr. Cites azura. Well, I wasn't any the wiser, but it turns out to be the only what's the word I'm looking for? It's a raptor, if you like, of the caddisfly family, and it actually just attacks its own sort. So it's a predator of caddisflies and those sorts of insects, and it just crawls around the reeds, grabbing hold of them with these amazing pincers and consuming them just like a spider would or anything else. And I didn't know that family of creatures had any predatory members amongst them at all until then. And of course, it's amazing, isn't it? That was about 5 years into the project. Never seen anything of them in my life before. And the minute I got my eye in, I saw them nearly every day I went there. And the following year, I even had one in my own pond out the back garden here, which is only about 3 foot diameter. So they're probably everywhere, but you just don't know it until you've tuned in. Crickets and grasshoppers, of course, with all that grass down there, plenty of those. The rarest one I found down there was this slender bush cricket. They're quite noisy, they're quite distinctive. Many of the grasshoppers can make noises, but you don't often hear them. It's the crickets that make the most persistent and constant noises. And a bit like birds, you can, with a bit of practice and use of an app or listening in online or whatever, get the hang of identifying the creature by its particular call. So there's a scarce one called the Roussel's cricket down there, which I'm pretty much every time identify as soon as I hear it. Just takes a bit of practice, but there's quite a few of those species there. Here's the Roussel's, a new species to the southeast of England in the last few decades. It was found in London first about 25 or so years ago, and it's gradually worked west. And the Jubilee River was one of the most remote places that we'd found them for a while, but I think they're pretty much all over the county now. Roussel's bush cricket, with this lovely sort of half circle of creamy white around the side of the head. That stands out very well when you get a good view of it. And of course, you can't expect to have a bit of water alongside you without seeing grass snakes. They're great aquatic creatures. They can swim. I've seen them swim across the river more than once. On one occasion, I was down actually near the weir at the Taplow end, and I saw one jump into the water over the far side. And together with the flow and the rate of progress, I worked out pretty much where it was going to land on my side. And I managed to sprint down to that point, sit down on the bank, and it came up onto the water right at my feet, curled itself up and just lay there to dry out, right within about a foot of my feet, as it were. Then I eventually had to crawl away without disturbing it, having had the best views of a grass snake I've ever had in my life. So thank you, Jubilee River, for that experience. And then, of course, on any amount of water, and the Jubilee River is no exception, the Mute Swan. This is the male doing his display. It's very, very graceful. The Mute Swans are having trouble, it seems, on the waters at the moment. I don't know if many of you get to Windsor, where there used to be hundreds, 200 to 300. there, but we're finding that either they're not getting the right sort of food or enough of the food, but their numbers are falling back, and more of them are finding themselves taken off to the Swan Rescue Centre in the county to be looked after. So they are all looked after. They very rarely lose them, but they do have to spend a lot of time on medications and feeding to restore them to the wild. So something's going on. You may remember 30, 40 years ago, many of the swans in the country were dying for lead poisoning from the fishing activities until the government made it a rule that anglers should change from lead weights to some other material. And most of them have done that. So I think that helped the mute swan restore its numbers. Well, there we are, folks. That is the Jubilee River. That's what I found in the few years after it's opened. It's changed a little bit now. The maintenance regime has not been perhaps kept as high as one would hope. So it's a little bit overgrown in places. That's had an impact on the type of wildlife you'll find. But all along there and all of the habitats either side of it is still a wonderful walk to expect to see anything of the sort I've talked about tonight, and many, many other things as well. So I hope it's given you an indication of what the trouble was that went to cause it to be built, the amount of effort that went to bring it about, the history it's had in its first 2 decades as a wildlife haven, and let's hope it will continue to enthrall many generations well into the future. So thank you very much for listening, and if there's any questions, I'll endeavour to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian, very much. That's great.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any questions for Brian? But that was very comprehensive. I'm glad you added the snake at the end, because we do enjoy having a snake cross us on the paddle boards. We don't point it out though to our paddlers, because not unless they're experienced, because they're always afraid of falling in, and they don't.
Oh yes, of course.
They don't want to know that they've just crossed one.
If I go stop share, will I now be able to see more of the faces?
Yeah, let's see who we have. So Julie, was it you who said about Brian did say it was a storm, it wasn't Maidenhead Sailing Club that removed the box, it was a storm.
I know it's me, it's John Hirsch. So
oh yes, he did say it was a storm.
Yes, the sailors didn't mind the turn round.
Yes. Yes. Great. Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, Brian,
Yes.
Did you miss out the grey-leg geese?
Well, I did, because I mean, I could have put another 100 species in there. We found huge numbers of different sorts, and I think most people are fairly familiar with those. Again, it's a non-naturalized species here, but certainly around the Cookums is probably 100 or 200 pairs now. So I thought we could avoid that one and look at the slightly more interesting species for the talk. So no, I hadn't forgotten it, but just skipped over it.
Great.
Brian, just one question. Richard Banfield.
Oh, Richard,
Would it be
I can't see you.
possible?
Where are you?
If it, I don't know. Would it be possible to at least recreate one of the islands as a scrape? Even if we can't maintain them all in the way that was originally planned, would it be possible for, I don't know, a volunteer group or something to try and maintain one of the islands?
I'd love to see that happen, and I'd been asked that by I forget who now, some time ago, and I would have nominated one of those at the Dawny Wetlands area. The one just to the Windsor side of the wooden bridge, I would have thought would be the best one, because that was specifically designed with a gravel covering for the rarer of those birds, the plovers, the red shanks, the common terns. And it did prove very valuable for quite a while, but that's the bit that's totally overgrown. It would need to have all of that material really taken off, to be honest, and probably recovered in gravel, maybe even over a plastic sheeting to make sure future growth would be controlled. But that would be a wonderful thing to do. And I've been advocating to other groups before that it needs something like a Friends of Jubilee River or a Friends of Dawny Wetlands.
Eaton Wick, I don't know if anyone's from Eaton Wick Waterway group. I discovered them this week after the litter picking. But that's what I like about Maidenhead Sailing Club, is that it has got that area, and we do have a wide range of birds there.
Yeah, if that could be done. And I mean, there are now, we've formed these two groups I've mentioned more than once, Wild Cookham and Wild Maidenhead. Do look them up, because they've got interesting activities online. But as a result of that, now we've got a Wild Ascot, we've got a Wild Windsor, we've got a Wild Eton, we've got a Wild Datchet. And all of these clubs getting together on their particular sections of the Jubilee River could possibly come together and do just what you're suggesting. So I think there's a great scope for that, and given the necessary permissions and safety measures that would have to be taken, of course, I would have thought the EA and the local councils involved would be delighted to have somebody doing something to restore it to its former glory, as it were. Yeah.
Perhaps we can sort that out, because it's always good winter projects, aren't they, to do? Perhaps we can
Yes,
sort that out for
that's
next
true.
year.
Yeah, there's a lot of material would have to be removed, and of course there's quite significant sort of almost treescape now, so it's not all just loose material. There's quite heavy timber bits would probably have to come out. But yes, it would be wonderful if that could happen, if at least just one of the islands, as I say, could be restored. There's another significant island up at the Marsh Lane end, as you may know, that big long one that heads off towards the Windsor direction, and that's where common terns have been breeding for some years, for about 3 or 4 years. And one year we were down there, a couple of us bird watching, counting the young, and there were about, I think, 9 pairs, and they'd produced 28 youngsters, and they'd all got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're now just about full size. They were flapping their wings. They were in a few days probably of fledging and flying off, and that's when the mink decided that with the adults having done all the feeding and they're at prime condition, a pair of mink came backwards and forwards from the far bank and took the lot in 30 minutes, stuffing them all down holes in the banks they'd prepared as their sort of larders. And pretty much the common terns gave up after that. So that's how bad mink can be. But if their numbers are reducing, it would certainly be worth trying to get these birds back again.
Good.
Brian, a quick question for you. So at the sailing club, we have the grebes,
yeah.
And I've heard the youngsters called humbugs. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, that's a good name for them, because Everton sort of humbugs, black and white stripes from end to end, toe to toe, as it were. Both the great crested grebe and that smaller one, the little grebe I mentioned, their young look just like that. Yeah, that's a good term for them. I've heard that used before. Yeah.
Good.
What else is there? A lot of faces turned up since I last looked at the screen of faces. Hello again, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian, because I don't know if we think we booked you for the sailing club last year, just before the pandemic.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So I'm really pleased that I think it's a really nice thing for winter to have. You've got lots of different. I've got the whole list of all your talks, and I think you've done a couple for me before. So
yep.
As fundraisers,
yep.
but fundraisers. So
yeah,
really
happy
appreciate.
To do that.
We'll do this again, and perhaps we'll get you down. We'll have the paddleboard Maidenhead will have a new location this year, so we can get you down either on a paddleboard, or I have a little inflatable 8-foot boat I've just bought with a little electric engine. We can get you out and do the talk actually on the river by we like the Hedser area. It's really
I've seen that done before. I can't remember who did it from a boat. Oh, I think it was Jesus, wasn't it? That was it. Yeah.
Well, we'll invite you down, Brian. You're the Jesus of birds around here, and the expert. But yeah, been really, really fantastic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and lovely to see you all, and perhaps bump into some of you on the water or whatever.
Yeah, and the next one I want to do is the one you did on red kites and buzzards. That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think people might be interested in that one, because we have so many of them around here. So
we do. Yes, they're doing well.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Yes.
I say the next ones will be on the water or alongside the water. So just keep in touch through the newsletter. That's probably the best thing. When we have them, I'll let you know when we have anybody speaking. I'm looking for a geologist to do the next one. So, and I say Brian's got a lot to keep us going for the next decade, I think. So
just hope I can keep going for the next decade.
Oh, you'll be fine. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
God bless everyone.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Wave, everybody.
Bye. Hi, Tina and Andrew again. John Vernon. Peter Cook, you got in, my neighbour. Fantastic. Jessica, hello.
Yeah.
You got your mother there. Looks like.
Yes, in fact, yes, we are actually at her place. So.
Oh, how lovely. Up in Yorkshire.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. Hello, Jessica's mum.
Hello.
I bet you're enjoying the company. Hope it doesn't snow up there. It's very cold here today.
Yeah, it's cold here as well. But yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We'll see you on the water, Jessica. Hello,
Okay.
Peter. Oh, bye, Peter.
Oh, he's
Yeah.
gone.
Bye bye. Oh, stop video. Stop recording even. Thank you for joining us at Paddleboard Maidenhead. See you on the river.